Oh, we got another person joining. All these young dancers and actually small students taking expertise and kind of understanding that and feeling that. It's a pretty good crowd. We should have lockdown quarantine, right? A pretty good crowd joining. That was a joke, right? So let's see if Ray can get audio.
There's everybody.
Hey, Ray. Thanks for joining.
How you doing?
Good. Long time no talk. Hope you're doing well.
Been a while.
So, well, we can get started. And this week, this month, we have a special guest. There might be more special guests, but I invited Aaron Gervais from Otherwise Brewing.
Everyone.
Thanks for joining, Aaron. And if you've been following any of the Gluten Free Home Brewing blog and also Aaron's website, there's several good blog posts that he posted over the last, I don't know, when you started posting those, and was that February?
A few months ago, yeah.
So wanted to talk with him a little bit about his operation he has got going on in San Francisco, and also about enzymes and things like that. So thanks for joining, Aaron.
Sure, happy to do it.
So I've been so before we get started on that, I've been reading. Let's see if you can see this. This book, is everything backwards?
No,
it came out right. Yeah.
Okay.
Lager, right?
Mm-hmm.
This
Nice.
is pretty good. This is pretty good. So interestingly enough, right, in this book, they talk about something that happened actually in 1553 this week in 1553. I thought was pretty interesting. So in 1553, the Duke of Bavaria, Duke Albrecht, he banned summer brewing in Bavaria from April 23rd to September 29th. And that ban lasted for almost 300 years. I thought that was really interesting, right? Part of the reason why they banned summer beer brewing was because they didn't have refrigerators, right? So, and, oh, that's much better. So it's pretty interesting, right? In terms of the Reinheitsgebot proclamation that was proclaimed in 1516, which we all kind of frown upon because it says beer has to be barley, hops, and water, and we get a little bit bent out of shape because we don't use barley, right? So I thought it was interesting that a lot of the reason why they proclaimed those things to be key ingredients into the production of beer was mainly because people were throwing all sorts of nasty, funky shit into their beer, right, and making people sick. So it wasn't really because it was something special about barley or you had to use those ingredients. It's mainly because people were getting sick and they wanted to stop that from happening, right? So, and as part of that, they just plain stopped brewing beer in Bavaria in the summertime because it led to funky, sour, nasty, infected beer, right? So I thought that was really interesting. I wanted to just bring that up because it happened this week in 1553. So, and it's funny because even with the liquid yeast that we were trying to get from Gluten Free Home Brewing, right? It's kind of like we have our own summer ban on delivery of liquid yeast for brewing. Now, maybe Aaron or JP, I don't know. Do you guys even use liquid yeast, or are you mainly doing dry yeasts in your breweries?
Yeah, I'm just using dry yeast.
Okay. Yeah.
I've experimented a little bit with propagate liquid yeast and mostly with the Norwegian Crick yeast, but I can get that dry from Lallemand now, so I'm back to 100% dry.
Okay, cool. And then I know like Ghostfish, they use like seven. I think they said they use like 7 generations. They just keep reusing the same yeast. Do you guys just keep reusing the same yeast over and over again until it's done? Or is that a secret question?
I think eventually we will reuse yeast, but the way we're set up now, it's not practical. We haven't technically launched yet, so our first few batches are going to be about, let's see what kind of market we can get. And because we're brewing in another facility, the smallest size batch we can do is 30 barrels. So that's a lot of beer to move for a new brand. So for the start, we're not planning on reusing yeast, but over the long term, yeah, that's the idea, because you save money that way.
Aaron, what's your launch date? Sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Our launch date was supposed to be May 16th, but that's that's not happening.
Fair. Sorry, JP.
We did at the beginning, when we were really small, we were reusing yeast. I got a little bit sour on it there for a while. Not that I got a sour, there was no problem with it. But I was looking at the cost of ingredients and thinking, with this, as much as I'm spending on everything else, dry yeast is relatively expensive. Dry yeast is relatively inexpensive anyway. So I just went to fresh pitch for everything. It behaves better. I've done a lot of repitching with the liquid Creek yeast that we used. I did repitch that like 7 to 8 generations, something like that, and never had any problem with it. And I've never had any problem with any repitching. But it's also a logistics thing, if you don't want to wash the yeast to put it to sleep, to reuse at a later date, then you've got to arrange so that your brew on the day that you rack off the yeast lines up with the brew day for the next one that uses the same yeast. And it just became complicated for us because we also don't use a house yeast strain. We use multiple different strains for different beers to get the different expressions. So how's that for a complicated answer?
That's yeah. Thank you, JP.
Yeah.
I was thinking we could change Brian from Gluten Free Homebrewing's name to the Duke of Ashland. Right? Keeper of liquid yeasts. Does he have like a big refrigerator in his warehouse there full of liquid yeast? So, how's everyone doing? How's everyone doing with the quarantine? You guys doing okay? You hanging in there?
Hanging in.
You guys, anyone brewing beer? Who's brewing beer? How about that?
I did a couple of weekends ago anyway. Doing another batch next weekend.
Yeah.
I was going to do it today, but I didn't want to miss this.
I think I brewed 3 batches within the last little over a month, that's the most in that period of time I think I've ever brewed. So definitely a lot of extra time.
I did the same kind of right when this whole thing kicked off. I just went for it and was brewing kind of like 3 weekends in a row almost, or I think I did twice in 1 week. And then now I'm like, okay, this is getting out of control. I can't drink all this beer. I gotta brew, but I gotta chill for a second.
Yeah, because Ben? I know you got a keg set up. Are you kegging all that beer, or
yeah? So I basically I've got the stout is like halfway through, and then basically whatever I only have a 2-tap setup, so whatever else I'm just gonna have in my keezer set to pressurize it and just have it set in there, and then if I want to hook it up, I can go through the whole process, but I'll probably just let it sit. The Kolsch is on there right now, but if I want to pull it off and put something else on there, it'll just benefit from some conditioning anyway, right? So yeah.
So I had written down a few things I want to talk about Aaron with, and I don't know if anyone has any questions specific to your blog post. But before we do that, maybe you could just give us a high level of like your how you got interested in gluten free brewing, and like just a kind of general high level like how you got interested and how you became interested to make it like a profession.
Right. Okay. I got interested in gluten-free brewing because of my family, basically. You know, a lot of them have issues with gluten. I don't, at least not yet. But you know, I had enjoyed making beer for a while, and I wanted them to be able to enjoy it too. So I started experimenting with gluten-free brewing, and I really liked the results I was getting. And I also really liked the fact that there was a lot about it that was unknown, and people were sort of discovering how these ingredients worked and how to use them. I've always been a very curious person. I'm always asking why about stuff. So like to be able to dig into that and some of the things, you know, when you first start brewing, they tell you this does this and that does that, and then to be able to dig into, okay, why does that work? Why does it not work when I'm using these other grains in different ways and all these kinds of things? So that part was really fascinating for me. And then I was kind of ready for a change of direction in my career, and I knew a few professional brewers in the area, and it was sort of talking to the right people at the right time. And I ended up meeting my partner, Stellar, who's in beer sales, and she and I decided to start this brewery together. And there are no gluten-free breweries in the Bay Area currently, so because this was already an interest of mine, we decided why don't we double down and make this an exclusively gluten-free brewery. Um, and and it's been great. I mean, you know, our plan initially was to launch in the middle of May. The pandemic shut that down. Thankfully, our timing was fortuitous because we were supposed to order all our ingredients uh, about the week before the lockdown here in San Francisco, uh, and already people were panic buying. So I was having trouble getting certain things. So, you know, supply chain things were already getting complicated. So we had a meeting that week, and we're like, it looks like, you know, we might be pushed back a little bit because of this thing. Hopefully it doesn't get too bad. And then next week, of course, you know, everything sort of shut down, and so it's kind of on hold now. You know, we don't know when the new launch will be, but thankfully, because we're launching as a contract brand, we're not paying rent on a facility. We don't have employees that we have um, to pay wages to or anything like that. So it's pretty easy for us to just hold tight for a while. So, you know, we'll see how long this whole thing lasts, and then we'll have our new launch plan based on that. So I've just been taking the time to continue refining our initial launch recipes, and also to explore some more basic questions about some ingredients, things that were on my checklist of things to do, but that I hadn't gotten around to yet. So I've been brewing a lot of experimental beers. A lot of them, I just brew them and taste them and dump them because it's really about answering a question and not really about, you know, having beer to drink. But I do at least one of those a week. And then when I have questions that I can answer with smaller mash only things, then I will do mini mashes using a sous vide circulator and little amounts of malt in mason jars and stuff like that. And I've done close to 100 of those now. And those have been really helpful in sort of um, nailing down the best way to use enzymes and the various temperature steps and stuff like that, and what effects various things have with each other. I'm working on a new blog post now on getting good foam in gluten-free beers, and from some of my experiences with On Pro, and also talking to some other brewers about what had worked for them and what had worked for me, and trying to figure out why that was. So one of the things I had done was I was really, you know, I was pretty sure it had to do with protein content and the way proteins are changed in the malting process of gluten-free grains. But that was just a hunch. So what I ended up doing was getting a protein testing kit from a wine company, Vinmetrica. So they winemakers always have to test their must, the grape juice, for nutrients, because it's going to vary from lot to lot and from harvest to harvest, and they don't want to have funky tasting wine. So they always test to see how much protein is in the wine. So I use that to do a series of tests, and that'll be in my next blog post. But definitely I did see Ondia Pro increases the amount of protein that's available to the yeast, which is helping the flavor. It also increases the amount of protein, presumably, that's available for head retention. And then I was able to compare some other things like biscuit rice malt really helps with head retention. So when I did the test on that, I saw, well, biscuit actually has half the yeast nutrition of pale rice malt. I was like, well, why is that? That seems counterintuitive, but then I gave it a little more thought, and it makes sense because, I mean, you're starting with the same rice, so they have the same amount of protein. So all that's happening is that half that protein is no longer available for the yeast. Instead, it's been transformed in some other way. And, from experience, it seems to be transformed in a way that increases foam. So it's been fun to sort of track down those kinds of questions and experiment so that it's not just, well, it always worked that way, but sort of like, now I know why that worked and how might that improve our process going down the road.
And I think you buried the lead there. I think you said you dumped 90% of your beer, right? So that means if you have someone in the Bay Area that's on the meeting here, go find where all that beer is getting dumped.
Yeah, no, yeah, I'd be happy to share. At first, I thought, oh, I'll just bottle it and give it away to friends, but that's a lot of work bottling all that beer, So
yeah,
you want to come over and bottle it yourself, you're welcome to have it.
A couple of things that jumped out to me about the blog posts that you have on your website. One of which on the myths about gluten-free mashing was jumped out to me. A couple of them on that was the dosage amount, right? So I think everyone that is in this meeting, or I don't know, for me personally, I'm usually using like a tablespoon, a little bit more than a tablespoon. When I started, I was dumping in 2 tablespoons, just because, more is better. But and reading your blog post, a lot of the manufacturer recommendations, I know that you called out Thermomil, for example, 3 to 5 mil for like 15 pounds of grain.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's the same across the enzyme spectrum, but talk to us about that, because I think it's a money saver for us home brewers. And I think a lot of times maybe we're just dumping way too many enzymes into our mashes.
Yeah, I made a little calculator for various, and maybe I can share that with you guys. You put in how many pounds of grain, and it tells you sort of the minimum and maximum manufacturers recommend dosage, and then whether or not you choose to use that or not is up to you. But I did some of the mini mash tests that I did were about figuring out enzyme doses, and I went from the smallest dose I could accurately do with the mini mashes was because I have these little 1 milliliter syringes that I use to measure the enzyme for that. The smallest dose I could do was the manufacturer's maximum for most of them. But I could go way above, with like 100 grams of malt. I could go to like 20 or 30 times, and I never saw any benefit. It didn't improve the speed. It didn't improve the yield. The only things that mattered were to have something within the manufacturer's range, and then to hit the temperature, pH, and timing correctly. Those things made a difference, but adding more enzyme didn't seem to make a difference. So what I typically do now with Thermomil, because it's relatively cheap as far as the enzymes go, is I will usually use a little bit more than the maximum dose, just in case there's some viability issue in my particular thing, like who knows. So the dosage it calls for might be something like 4 milliliters, so I might use 6 milliliters instead, something like that, for 15 pounds of grain. And that gives me, I've never had that fail for me. That's over dozens of brew sessions using those calculations. I've always gotten good conversion on that. So the enzymes all have different dose ranges. The Ondia Pro actually has higher dose ranges because it's not just one enzyme, it's like about a dozen enzymes in there. So that one you do need to use a little bit more. But I think for around 15 pounds of grain, that still works out to maybe like a teaspoon or something like that, somewhere in that range.
Aaron, just for context, I guess questions are, what kind of grains are you using? Is it rice or millet combination? And then I guess just around your general mash routine. Curious to know what that looks like.
I really like rice malt. That was really the thing that made me fall in love with gluten-free brewing. And I've talked a lot with Jim Eckert about his operation and try to get the most out of the malt. So most of our beers are predominantly rice malt, but I do use millet malts as well, and buckwheat I really like too. I use some raw quinoa as well in some of our beers. I think buckwheat adds a really nice sort of background note to a lot of beers, and plus it gives you good head retention. So I've used a lot of buckwheat, and then there is some things you can get in the millet malts that you can't get in the rice malts, and those really add complexity. So most of my grain bills will be somewhere around 70 or 80% rice. But rice is a little harder to mash with. It's just the reality. I have a herm set up here on our test kit here, so it makes it easier for me to move temperatures around and hold them. So I tend to start high because Thermomil works best high, and the rice needs high temperatures in order to fully gelatinize. So I'll start out. Lately, what I've been doing is I've been holding it at 170 degrees for the first 45 minutes and then ramping up for the last 15 minutes to 180. Because Thermomil's target temperature is 182, and every single variety of rice gelatinizes below that. It's around 180, I think, for the top one, somewhere around there. So I figure if I go at 170 for a while, I'm minimizing the amount of tannin extraction that you get from higher temperatures. But then if I kick it up for the last little bit to 180, then I can sort of maximize gelatinization and give the terminal the time to get into the nooks and crannies there. And then I'll use my herm system to drop the temperature down to 130, and that's when I add Ondia Pro and Fungamol, which is the same thing as Sebamol L, which Gluten Free Homebrewing sells. It's just made by the Terminal people, and that gives me pretty good words. From that, I get really good yields, and the sugar that it's making is mostly maltose, so the yeast characteristics you get from that are really good. And from there, I sort of follow the Ondia Pro guidelines, which is 20 minutes at the lower temperature around 130, and then 40 minutes at around 140 for the other enzymes, and then mash out back at 170. So it takes about, the actual mash is about 2 hours, and then I do forlau for about 20 minutes and then drain into the kettle. So I can get it all into the kettle usually in about 3 hours, start to finish.
That was 170, 182, 130, 140 mash out. Is that right?
Yeah, sorry, it's a little complicated.
No,
It's high, low, high, basically.
Yeah. What about, another thing that jumped out to me, and this is probably a perfect time to ask about that, was mash thickness. I know that a lot of people, we mash maybe 1.2 quarts per pound of grain, pretty thick mash. In your article, you had said you didn't really see a significant difference in mash thickness in terms of starches converting to sugars within your mash.
Yeah, it was very, very small, from super dry to super wet, and it's easier to work with a thin mash. So that's sort of been my philosophy, is not make my job harder than it has to be.
Have you done, I just got done, and I thought it was really fun, right, was doing a decoction mash, my last brew. I thought it was like, it's more interaction with your brewing, right? So I know a lot of people would be like put off by maybe the amount of time and stirring and yada, yada, yada. And the herms and rim system looks pretty fancy, but I mean, in my mind, it's kind of like the oldest school of like rims or herms, or having a step up type of mash. Have you ever done any kind of decoction mashes, and what's your experience with other mashing styles other than the herm system you have today?
I haven't done a decoction mash, though it's on my list of things to try, because decoction lagers in particular are usually really good. Just too many other things to try out. When I started home brewing, I was mashing in a cooler like most people do, and that worked fine for single infusion mashes. But it's really tricky with the kinds of mash protocols that we need for our brewing to do that. So I don't really have any good suggestions there other than that. If you're looking to invest in something, probably a heated mash tun of some sort will go a long way, to be able to control the temperatures and move them up.
There is only one kind of beer, right? There's no other. No, I'm just kidding. I've been reading lager books that I got for Christmas, so I've got lager on the brain and decoction mash, and that's all I've been thinking about. It's a problem. I understand. Another question I had for you, and I wasn't really sure what the answer was. So Ondia Pro, in terms of enzymes, right? So that enzyme, does that negate you even needing to use something like Termamil within a mash because it already contains saccharification enzyme within it, or would you? The last mash, for instance, I used in my decoction mash, I used all three enzymes. I used Ondia Pro, 7-MLL, and Termamil. But it sounds like maybe Ondia Pro includes something within it that would do what Termamil does in terms of a saccharification enzyme. So is it unnecessary, do you think, in that regimen to even use a Termamil enzyme?
I think if it's a millet-based beer, probably it is unnecessary because you don't have to start at the high temperature. You can start low and move up. So yeah, in that case, yes. I think for rice, starting high and then going down and then coming back up, you do still need Termamil for the initial high step. And I'm just looking here in my spreadsheets because of my some of my mini mashes, because I think I did look specifically at that question at some point. So let me see here if I can find an actual answer for you as to what happens when you omit Termamil from the Ondia Pro regimen. Give me a second here.
For what it's worth, I've found, because most of my beers are millet heavy. They're probably, I'm kind of the opposite of you, Aaron. I'm probably 80% millet, and then rounding out the rest with rice and buckwheat. But I found that just kind of checking along the way, using Ondia and without anything else. As soon as I added the Termamil at the end step, I got a huge jump up in saccharification, even with that kind of grain bill. So I think I can imagine that Ondia is probably doing something in there, but I do still see kind of a cocktail benefit of having a couple of enzymes.
Yeah, I found that test I was looking for, and it does show that the Termamil plus Ondia got about 20% better yield than Ondia alone. So at least this was a set of tests I did in January. So yeah, that makes sense to me. Termamil is just such a great enzyme. Like it works extremely well, and it's very efficient. And as long as you can get into the temperatures it likes, it'll really chew up anything.
Yeah.
Aaron, have you done any experiments with millet only using Ondia Pro? I know something that kind of a lot of us are starting to think about is how much additional, PPG is attached to the millet compared to, the rice we all know now has a lot more potential than we previously thought. And we're kind of now trying to wonder about the millet. I know you do mainly rice, but have you tried any just millet with Ondia Pro?
Honestly, no. It is on my list of things to do, though. I have a few other questions that I want to answer in terms of tweaking our launch recipe, so that's the first step for me. But I'm very curious about that too, because our Imperial Stout is about half millet and half rice. So definitely it would be useful for me to. I've been going with the assumption that everything gets me about 30 ppg, and that sort of works out. Although in the last couple of brews, I actually got a little higher than I was expecting yield. So I think it does probably help with millet as well. I don't have definitive numbers though, but I have been researching a lot, like in terms of what maximum yield is. yesterday I brewed a beer entirely with dehulled pale rice malt, and the idea was to try to see what's the maximum that you can get when you don't have the rice hulls there. I added in rice hulls later for lautering, but I ended up getting from that about and I was very careful about trying to maximizing every variable that would give me yield. I went for a slightly smaller crush, um, hitting all the temperature and enzyme things exactly right, and I got a mash. The mash initial running yield was 36 points per pounds per gallon. So that's for rice without the hull. So I think rice with the hull, we're probably going to be closer to, 32 at the absolute theoretical maximum, somewhere around there. And with Ondia Pro, I've been getting maybe in the 30 range. So millet could be the same thing. Could be that it has a theoretical yield somewhere in the mid 30s, and then with Ondia Pro, you'll be able to get actual yields in the sort of low 30s.
Do you do any pH adjustment while you're mashing?
I do, yeah. Definitely helps with the flavor, but that's something I did for years, even before I started Gluten Free Brewing. I'm a big advocate of pH. After you get your heated mash done, the next thing you should get is a pH meter, because you just, everyone's water is different, so I can't really tell you what to do. You need to use one of those calculators to figure out what to put in there. But the difference in flavor between a beer that's been mashed at the right pH and not at the right pH is pretty large. It really takes it the extra way.
So are you doing different pHs for the different enzyme steps, or do you have one number that you kind of think is a sweet spot for all of the steps?
It's usually based around the grain bill and what kind of mineral content I want in the beer. So I'll have a range that I'm shooting for and it's the sort of the standard range between like 5.2 and 5.5. And I try not to go too much above or below that. And depending on what I need mineral wise to balance the grain bill, I'll try to stay in there. One thing that I have noticed with our malts that's different from barley, normally in a barley mash, the pH will continue to drop over time. And then by the time you get to the end of the boil, you're closer to 5.1 or 5.0. And that's not the case, at least not that I've seen with our malts. Your mash pH pretty much stays steady all the way till the end of the boil. So I do, at the end of the mash, if I'm higher up, like in the mid 5s, then I'll use a little bit of acid to bring that down, because a higher boil pH brings out harsh bitterness from the hops. So usually you want your hops to be boiling, not too much above 5.3, just to get the best flavor out of them.
What about I'm kind of I've been switching the opposite of what Stuart is doing, and I think I started out with more millet heavy beers, and I think that's just because I did a rice beer, and I didn't get any I used the wrong enzyme, and I didn't get any extracted at all, and it just made me mad, and I was like, screw it, I'm just gonna do millet beers, right? And then millet is easier to mill, and it's easier to kind of get some sugars out of it, I think. And but I find myself moving more and more towards rice with this last couple batches I did with Ondia Pro, and I feel like that there's a lot of potential in those grains that a lot of people haven't been really utilizing, and we haven't been extracting as much sugar as I think we could out of those grains. I know that I got a shipment from Eckert that was the 4L biscuit, which, man, when you mill that, it smells amazing. And I don't know, Aaron, if you've used the different biscuit rice malts or just the standard, but some of those new rice malts are really, really smell good.
Yeah, they do. I have used the 18L, the darkest one. It gives like a really intense, grainy, bready kind of flavor. And I haven't used the 4L yet, but I've heard a lot of good things about it, so it's on my list.
Yeah, I know JP, he dropped off, but he on I think it was the last meeting, he was singing the praises of, I think the one you're talking about, Aaron.
Mm-hmm.
He said he loved it, and he got a special shipment of it prior to them actually distributing it, because he said it was just like the best new malt that's out there. And so I'm excited to use those for sure. And um, I feel like they're probably going to be good for my next few lager brews that I do.
I was going to say, I think there's probably something to the flavor profiles, and I wonder if with the lagers, especially the light lagers, you're going to get cleaner, or I don't know, maybe something closer to what your target might be with a rice heavy grain bill.
I would think so. Aaron, have you been doing any lagers or anything like that? Or are you
Yep.
strictly an ale guy?
No. We've got a lager. I do kind of, if I had to pick a side, I'd say I'm more of a lager brewer at heart. And I've spent a lot of time working on our lager recipes, and yeah, there's a bit of biscuit in there, a bit of buckwheat, and the rest is pale rice malt. But yeah, you can definitely get a flavor profile using rice malt in a lager that your average beer drinker would not know is gluten free. So you can get a lot of delicious flavors out of there. It's a little harder than the traditional German, just throw in some Pilsner malt and be done with it. But definitely with those new biscuit malts, you can balance the flavor a lot. If you want sort of a clean, crisp lager that's more just about the sweetness and the yeast profile, or if you want one of the like grainier, breadier style lagers, you can get both of those with the new biscuit malts.
So what's it like? Let me ask you this question. This is maybe not really a home brewer question, but it's like a question about this kind of leap you got to take from being a home brewer to saying, I got a couple recipes, I'm ready, I have a business plan. And then first of all, have you brewed a big batch yet on your contract brew setup? And then like, what, if you have, was that scary as shit, or was it, or have you not done that? Like, I'm sure that at some point you had to brew a big batch of beer and there's like, oh, did I do this right? Right? Do you have that moment?
Yeah, I mean, I've brewed on professional brewing equipment before. I haven't brewed any of our beers at the brewery that we're going to be doing contracting with, which is a good thing, because if I had, then I would have to be selling all that beer right now in the middle of the pandemic. So I'm glad we haven't done that. But yeah, there are a lot of variables, and you definitely don't want to leave too much to chance, because you're spending a lot of money to make that beer, and then it only has a finite shelf life before you can sell it. So I mean, I've been attracted to the idea of running a business for a long time, and I have some experience running organizations. I ran an arts nonprofit for about 5 years, and in my current job in marketing, I work in a small tech company, and have been involved with the product development and the brand direction and all sorts of high level things, working with the CEO. So definitely the business side of things, tracking sales numbers and figuring out a go to market strategy, all that kind of stuff that you need in order to run a successful business. It's stuff that I have a bit of experience with and that I'm interested in pursuing more. And then beer is a great vehicle to be doing it with. And I think there's just so much potential in gluten-free beer. I think it's going to be something that's really going to take off over the next, 5-10 years or whatever it takes. It's going to be one of those waves, and people's perspective of what is beer has really broadened a lot. And the craft beer boom was one step in that. But even the craft beer boom, it's really focused on this small subset of beer styles from a specific part of Europe. And we're seeing this now with the quick yeast coming up in the farmhouse ales, that there are other kinds of brewing. But brewing goes beyond barley, and it goes beyond Europe. I mean, there's a tradition of farmhouse brewing from Korea. They make makgeolli. I don't know if any of you have ever had that. It's a rice beer. and it's made just like the Norwegian beers by like farmers with their extra harvest for special occasions, and they would ferment these rice beers, and it's enjoying sort of a renaissance in Korea right now too. So that's an aspect of beer history I'm very fascinated about, because there is anywhere in the world where they had grain, people were making beer with it, and it wasn't always barley that they had available. So they made beer with all sorts of stuff, and some of those beers are really delicious. So I think people are opening their eyes up to that, and the gluten-free movement, it gives us the opportunity to sort of push the science forward, while at the same time, connecting with some of these traditions that have always existed to use other kinds of grains. So that, I think I sort of went off on a tangent there, but that's really what excites me about this business. I see a lot of potential here, both in terms of making great beer and in terms of something that's going to have a viable market.
Yeah, it's fun. This book I've been reading was saying that I think it was like in the late '70s there was something like less than 100 breweries in the United States, right? And that was from like thousands and thousands and thousands of breweries that they had, like pre-prohibition and all this stuff, and it just went down to like nothing, and it was all just run by macro huge operations, and until that kind of craft brewery scene began to develop in the early '80s, there was almost nothing, and now it's like there's still not nearly as many like breweries as there used to be, but there's like what is like 5,000 or something like that. I mean, it's a lot, right? But in terms of gluten free, it's like what, less than 20,
Mm-hmm.
and so there's a lot of opportunity there for sure. I think
Yeah.
to make your mark, right? So I think we're just right in the beginning stages of it. I mean, when was Glutenberg opened and Groundbreaker? That was within what, the last 10, 12 years or something like that. So
Mm-hmm.
it's pretty young industry.
So as someone living in San Jose, what sort of distribution do you have set up? Are
I
they
was
going to be
wondering that too.
getting beers 45 minutes south, or what's the deal with that?
Yeah, we'll be distributing throughout the Bay Area, though. I mean, our focus is going to be to try to get the San Francisco accounts first, just to minimize our driving.
Of
But
course, yeah.
I can hook you up.
Yeah,
Just,
yeah.
let me know.
Are
Do you have
you doing bottles and cans as well, or are you hitting restaurants and pubs and things, or what's
Yeah,
the packaging
both. We'll be
perspective?
doing kegs and cans to start.
Yeah.
Nice.
Okay.
So do you have any relationship or know the guys across the bay from you that are setting up over at what is it, Buck Wild, whatever?
Right, Mike. What's his last name again? We've crossed paths a couple of times, but I don't know him really.
Yeah, don't know anything. Yeah.
Aaron, maybe I didn't catch it from your website. I was trying to find it. Where are you located in the Bay Area, and where are you setting up shop? And then what's the status of your setting up? I assume you're on hold a little bit.
Right. We're in San Francisco, and we're setting up in San Francisco. We were supposed to launch in the middle of May, but that's been put on hold. So we're just waiting to see when this whole thing gets resolved and figure out our new timeline. We're going to be brewing at Speakeasy Ales, which is in San Francisco. They have experience brewing gluten-free beers. So when I approached them about contracting on their equipment, they were like, yeah, no problem. We've brewed millet beers before. It's fine. So it was important, of course, to work with someone that knew a little bit about the challenges, both on the technical level and on making sure there's no cross-contamination, because I want to make sure our beers are as clean as possible, and there's minimize any chance of anything getting in there. We're not using their grain mills. We're not using their augers. Everything's going to be dumped into the mash tun by hand. Everything's going to be milled off-site. They're going to do a deep cleaning of all their equipment before we use it. So the fact that they were willing to accommodate us or all that stuff, and figure out how to do the temperature drops that I want to do in their mash tun, that was a big plus for us to be brewing with them. So our plan is to go with them probably for the first year or so, until we can sort of build a bit of a name for ourselves, and then that'll make it easier for us to get the capital that we need to open up our own space.
And are you doing contract or alternative proprietorship with them? And
Contract.
will you be able to do? Will you be able to be gluten certified?
Yes. Yes. Contract, and will be gluten certified in. I mean, there isn't an official certification, but we meet all the criteria for gluten free according to the FDA and the TTB.
So how much grain goes into the mash tun there, and how do you you have to get a truck to how do you get that? How much does that weigh? That's got to be a lot of to transport, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's not going to be me driving it there, but
You're taking it up in your pickup truck?
yeah, no, it wouldn't fit 1,000 pounds per batch. So the Imperial Stout is a little over. Is it even closer to 4,000? I think the Imperial Stout is closer to 4,000 pounds.
Wow.
It's pretty much the maximum they can fit into their mash tun. So that's a couple of pallets of grain. So it's going to come on a semi
That's
truck.
for
What barrel size do they have?
It's a 30 barrel.
Holy smoly!
Mhm.
What?
Can't even. Yeah.
How many styles are you guys launching with? You got that all sorted out? You know what you're going to be starting with?
Yeah, we're doing a lager, a hazy IPA, and an Imperial Stout.
Awesome.
Something for everyone, hopefully.
Yeah, that lager and hazy. It's been hard for me to get around here, so
Yeah.
So I think I'm probably one of the only people that's not in the Bay Area or on the East Coast. I'm actually out of Minnesota, and we only have one gluten-free brewery out here. And I have been trying like hell to get people to source GF beer from out your way out my way. How much of a pain is that to do, knowing that Minnesota's alcohol laws are ridiculous?
That's a good lead into my next question, which is what are your distribution plans? Self-distribute just locally, or are you thinking of going with a distributor, and at what level?
Right. So the sky's the limit. To start, we're starting small and starting local. So I haven't truthfully given a lot of thought into what the distribution requirements are for different states, though I do know just from stuff I've come across that it is different from state to state, and probably to get sort of a national presence, we'd probably want to work with an established distributor because it would make things that much easier. Yeah, I can't say definitively. I mean, for anybody on this call, I'm happy to sort of work with you one-on-one to sort of figure out a way for you to get some in whatever way we need to arrange that. But in terms of getting it into stores across the country, that's a little further down the road than I can predict right now.
Yeah, I know people in this homebrew clubs ship a lot of yeast samples, right?
Yeah.
And they always want to know what we mean by yeast samples.
Yeah, was that Matt? Was that Matt talking, or are you in Minnesota, Matt?
Yep, I'm in Minnesota.
Right on.
I think I talked to a couple other people about that question too, and the unfortunate side of it for Minnesota specifically is they tax pretty heavily to import beer from other states, and it deters a lot of people from the East Coast and the West Coast from bringing their beers to this Midwest, especially Minnesota, just because it's really not cost effective for them because they don't get as much of a net gain off of it because they're having to spend so much money just getting it into the state, plus paying your distributors and whatnot to get it here. So it's been a pretty heavy deterrent for us getting anything but just our craft beer in Minnesota, which we have a ton of craft beer in the state, but like I said, we've only got the one GF brewery in
Is
St.
it Burning
Paul.
Brothers? Is that who you got?
That's
there?
the one. Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, and honestly, any home brewer I know, I'm one of the only people in the state that I'm aware of that does gluten free. So I'm kind of on my own little island for the most part.
Yeah, yeah.
Just curious, how easy is it for you to find Burning Brothers throughout the state? Are they pretty widely distributed throughout the state, or is it kind of local to wherever the brewery is based?
No, they're pretty well distributed. They got in with most of the main liquor stores in the state. Um, I think there's maybe a handful that I haven't seen them in, but most of the liquor stores I go to, either up in the northern metro where I'm at currently, and even down south where I work, all carry them pretty religiously, and they do sell pretty well. So
That's great.
Well, Matt, you're the reason why we have these meetings, so you can get together with people who actually brew GF beer and not just barley beers, right?
yeah, oh, well, and I'll
Yeah.
tell you, the people that brew barley beers and they see what I do, they're like, "Why do you do that?" I'm like, "Because it's fun." I'm like, "You get your stuff in a bag and you toss it into your mash tun and you're done." Like, there's a lot more to it for me than what you got to do.
Right. Yeah. It's the other thing that is unfortunate is there's just almost all of the literature that's out there is based on, barley brewing. Like that one of the books I had, New Brewing Lager, which is a great book, but the very first chapter is about barley, right? So it's kind of disconcerting when you're reading through that book. And I just skipped to the mashing chapter, right? And I was like, I'll just check this out instead. But because I don't want to learn about, well, I guess it's fascinating to learn about like a barley kernel and its structure and all that kind of thing. I guess it relates to other grains, but in the end, I get there's actually a need out there, and I'm sure someone one of these days is going to write a book that's. I think there is some kind of book out there, but there's not something that's really the definitive, guide to gluten free brewing, right? That would be nice.
I think, as Aaron, you were kind of saying at the beginning, there's, you're doing a lot of the science, and I don't think there's been a lot of science in this area. I mean, of course, there's a lot of crossover, and you still have malting and enzyme conversion and all that stuff, but you don't have breeding programs for millet looking at malting varieties of millet or rice for that matter. You don't have Siebel Institute or whoever else doing research on getting the most out of this. So it's people like you, Aaron, and in our own little citizen scientist ways, just sort of figuring out this stuff. I think it's kind of exciting. It's kind of cool, but for someone who's trying to get into it for the first time, it's a little bit disconcerting when there's really no reference point.
That's true. It definitely, if I was coming into it as a brand new home brewer who had never brewed anything before, it would have been really, I think, quite the challenge to overcome. Yeah. I mean, I just brewing with barley at start was a lot, sort of overwhelming. It took a long time to sort of learn all the ropes there, and then it's even more so with this. But I think one of the points that you brought up there is like with barley, it's been the preferred beer grain for centuries, if not millennia. So there's been a lot of selective breeding. At first, it was just done accidentally, or as farmers would pick the grains that work best for them. But there's been intensive selective breeding for at least 150 years to make barley that much more effective in the context of malting and mashing. That's why you get such fantastic yields from two-row barley. I mean, you get almost as much yield from two-row barley as you get from flaked rice, which is kind of crazy because flaked rice is like a purified processed starch, right? And then here you have this whole grain that's giving you almost as much yield. So we haven't had any of that. And my hope is that as gluten-free beer becomes more mainstream and becomes much more available, that there will be interest from professional breeders to come up with new varieties that will malt a little bit better, mash a little bit better, and make our lives less difficult, basically.
That's why it was interesting, Evan. I think it was University of Oregon that came to the meeting at Ghostfish there. He was talking about that exact thing, finding out the best variety of millet and, honing down what works best and going from there and trying to, breed it basically. Mm-hmm. So, in another 30 years, maybe we'll be a lot better off and have bigger millet that has this, great flavor and a lot out of it.
Yeah. We're actually, we're trying I'm trying to hopefully get. It's actually from University of Washington, and it's Evan Crane who was at that Magic of Millet. There was a presentation at Ghostfish called Magic of Millet. You're probably not familiar with it, Aaron, but it was pretty cool because they had a PhD candidate that was in the grain and soil sciences from from Washington State University, and he was talking about different millets varieties and production, and how like everyone in Eastern Washington, because I'm in Washington, right? Everyone in Eastern Washington just grows barley or wheat because it's a cash crop, right? Whereas in other parts of the country, in the front range of Colorado, where all of those grouse and and Colorado malting are there because there's farmers that actually grow millet, right? And he was talking about crop rotation and getting farmers to understand that it's good for the environment and good for your soil to rotate these crops. And millet is a good crop, but you also need to create a market for that resource, or the farmers are not going to grow it, right? So
Right.
I think there's a lot of opportunity to help farm, like if you can help a farmer understand, hey, this is a great crop for the environment, for your soil, and at the same time it's a cash crop, there would be a lot of opportunity in certain parts of the country that just don't grow it today because it's just not something that they get any money off of.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. If gluten-free beer grows at the same pace that craft beer grew in the previous 20 years, then there would definitely be farmers doing that, and our ingredient costs will come down, and it'll be easier to source, and the quality of the grain will be better. All good, all that good stuff.
I hear there's good farmland on Bowen Island.
What's that?
I hear there's good farmland on Bowen
Yeah,
Island.
there you go. Yeah. I need drought-like conditions, though. I think
There
for
you
some
go.
of these grains, and I think we've got an excess of moisture.
Yeah, the soys.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah.
You'll get
For-
like the
for kale
funkiest millets.
I don't know, a rice patty, that might be possible. I don't know if we've got the temperate
For
setup for that.
for kale and I guess anybody else in the Northwest Washington area, if you ever get an opportunity, take a tour of Skagit Valley malting up in Skagit Valley, and the whole background of how they got started, and it's an incredible malting process they do for a small maltery. And if you're going to do any traditional grains, I would definitely go with them as being a local supplier. But it started out as the local farmers there were growing barley as cover crop, but in the end they had nothing to do with it, with the exception of feed. And it turns out that barley is very simple because it's a barley which grows well in that area. It's very similar to Irish barley and a lot of the barleys that were used for traditional beers there. So it's there's some really unique barleys that come out of there. Really nicely run operation, good people. The tour is if you get a chance to tour it or contact somebody there, it's pretty educational in understanding grain. They're not doing anything with millet, etc. They supply brewing and a lot of bakeries in the area, but haven't done anything with pseudo grains to my knowledge at this point.
Yeah, I'll have to check it out. I for some reason I was thinking that Brian Thiel from Ghostfish was saying something about the Skagit Valley being good for growing millet as well, but I'm not sure if that's the reality or not.
Yeah, I don't know about that. It would make sense. I mean, it's a pretty incredible little agricultural valley, and as I understand it, millet grow in fairly moist environments. I've seen it on some test farms here. I'm in Vancouver. And it certainly grows well here, but I haven't seen anybody producing it on a commercial level.
Right. You still planning on opening a brewery? Was that you, Ray? You were planning on opening a brewery? Was that you?
Well, it's kind of in the back of my mind. I'm not sure yet. Nothing ventured or nothing to lose at this point. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask Aaron another enzyme-related question. I guess I'm curious about, have you done any experimentation with any just the endogenous enzymes, or just what's naturally available? Like, I don't know if you've seen any of Andrew Lavery's stuff, decanting some of the wort at the early stage before you denature it with high temperature. So have you tried any of that? Any results from that?
Honestly, no. Once I started with Gluten Free Brewing, and I read about some of these results, and it seemed like the enzymes was an easier way to get into it. So I went down that path, and then I've been trying to maximize the results from there.
Now, Stuart, don't you think? I mean, when I read the Lavery method or whatever, I mean, to me it just sounds like you're putting your decoction mash in the refrigerator. Like, I mean, it's essentially like a decoction mash, right? Where you're pulling liquid out, but then you heat up the rest of it to get to your next step.
Yeah.
Right?
So I guess like a decoction, you're pulling it off so that and then heating that wort that you pulled off. And I think I don't know, maybe this is in your logger book, but I think partly that evolved because of just the way they had for heating, and they almost had to use that kind of method to get to those higher mash temps and those rest temps. But in Lavery's program, it's basically pulling it off and then getting it cold. So when you add it back in, you're actually bringing down some of that, those temperatures that are risen up, and then you're kind of pulling it back down. So I think it's just, and so we don't get any beta amylase from any of these added enzymes we're using, and so to my mind, that's partly one of the potential benefits of it. You might get a little bit more maltose creation in something like that, but I haven't done a ton of experimentation with his method. Although I got to say, just looking at the discussion, I remember one of them, I don't know if it was Craig or somebody else, was suggesting getting an order of Ondia down in Australia, and I think it's Grant, the gluten-free brewer, who said, he's using that method. He's getting great results without I think he's probably got maybe a Termamil type of high.
I think he uses like one of the basic kind of like still spirits, like
right, yeah,
amylases or something, yeah.
Yeah. So they're getting similar results, but I think part of that is he's also decanting.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to try a decoction mash, no enzymes, and we'll see what happens.
Here's my other little pet theory is sweet potato. There's a lot of well, I've been looking into the research on sweet potato as the highest source of beta enzymes, or beta amylase enzymes. So in the last couple of brews, I've been adding chunked up sweet potato to the mash at 130 Fahrenheit, and it could be other enzymes that are doing it, but I'm actually getting way better attenuation at the end.
Nice.
And not a lot of sweet potato flavor.
And you already have dinner cooked too.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm not getting that Thanksgiving vibe out of it.
Yeah, from what I've read, you won't get much sweet potato flavor, if any. But are you cooking your sweet potato at all first? And if so, at what temperature? And or are you? I guess what I would think you would be best off doing would be shredding it.
Yeah, sort of I've been kind of I'll peel it and cube it and use it every piece of it. There was one article I came across. I think it was actually. It was an African-based, I think it was South Africa, that had done some research on this, because on that continent, a lot of their grains are, a lot of sorghum usage, and it doesn't have, again, similar things with enzyme conversion. They don't have a lot of natural enzymes, and so they actually did some research with using sweet potato enzymes, also another pretty readily available source, and their yields were quite impressive using that. But their method, the research method that they used was they basically shredded and dried it, or maybe they dried it and shredded it, but like no higher than 140 degrees, just to, so they didn't denature anything, I think, and then used it as sort of a powder. in the mash.
Yeah, I've heard of maybe of shredding it, but I guess to be able to make that would give you maximum surface area. The question would be,
would make
does
sense.
drying it make it more
Better.
water soluble, bring out
Maybe,
more of that? I don't know, but it'd be something that would be fun to experiment with.
Yeah, some more mini mash experiments. It sounds like another time investment.
Yeah. I had heard about the sweet potato thing, and you can actually buy purified sweet potato beta amylase, though it's too expensive to that you wouldn't want to use it in brewing. It's more for laboratory stuff.
Right.
But one of the first questions that I set out to solve was how to get maltose, because a lot of people earlier on, when I talked to the enzyme reps, they said, "Oh, you can use these enzymes and get glucose," and I said, "Well, I don't really want glucose because the yeast is going to ferment differently, and I want to preserve as much of the yeast character as possible. It was bred to eat maltose, so I want to give it maltose. So sebamyl L and fungamyl both are maltose generating enzymes. So I worked with those a lot to sort of figure out the ideal temperatures to generate maltose with those. And with both of those, assuming that your starch is pretty well gelatinized, I've been able to get attenuation that's the same as what you would get with the barley-based beer. So depending on the yeast strain and the style, anywhere from 65% attenuation for something like an Imperial IPA, all the way up to like 82, 83% attenuation for a lager.
Yeah. So remind me, are you using sebamyl after the Ondia or before, or kind of in parallel?
They go in at the same time for me.
Same time, okay. Because I was wondering whether you almost need to debranch with the Ondia or the Polonais before you can actually start to pull out those maltose molecules.
Yeah, that made sense to me intuitively at first, and that's I was also talking to Jason Euro about that, and he was learning the same thing, but I didn't see any difference when I did the kind of yield tests. The polonase debranching enzyme, it was maybe adding like 1 or 2% to the yield. It wasn't a major factor in the thing. The important thing was getting the starch gelatinized first with terminal. That really boosted up the yield, and then when you put in the other enzymes, they did all the conversion for you.
So you were I'm guessing then once you hit back down to 130 is when you're adding your sebamyl L and Ondia Pro, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. So yeah, that was one of my I think one of the Gluten Free Home Brewing blog posts kind of mentioned it, but I mean, I feel like there's rising step, falling step, decoction mash, and there's different ways you would add your enzymes like within each of those techniques. Yours is kind of like a little bit of both, right? Because you're doing a really high rest and then you go low and then back up high, right? Which I think was what like JP was saying in his blog post, like you want to gelatinize that rice the first thing off, right? And so I think that's essentially what you're doing in that first step, right? Is gelatinizing your rice, right?
Yeah. I did do tests to see how important is the gelatinization in terms of yield, and the answer is it's very important. You have the same enzyme quantities and the same hold times and everything, and one is gelatinized and one is not, and you get like a quarter of the yield when it's not gelatinized. So it makes a big difference. So at some point or another in the mashing process, however you figure out how to do it, if you're using rice, you're gonna have to get it up there into the 170, 180 range if you want to get the most yield out of it.
Yeah, I figured like when I was doing my decoction mash, sorry to keep harping on this, guys, but when I was putting that, really thick mash back in to boil, I was essentially boiling. I was making rice, right? So I figured I'm gelatinizing that batch of rice and throwing it back into the mash tun. And I did that several different times. So I figured I should be getting pretty good yield out of that if I'm doing it that way instead of just starting really high and then going down low and back up like you do. So essentially kind of like the same thing, but a different way of doing it.
Yeah, doing it in small batches a little bit at a time.
Right.
It's a good idea.
Yeah. Well, so I think What we've learned out of this is Aaron is going to send us all a shitload of beer, right? So that's fantastic.
Practice batches and real stuff.
I like this guy already.
Yeah, you're great. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks otherwise. Oh, another question before we get. I think we're above our time, but where's the idea from the name come from? Do you have a story behind the name, or is it just something that is catchy?
It was an intensive, long, painful brainstorming process. No, we had some things we wanted in mind. We wanted it to be something that was going to be talking about the fact that we're not using barley, so that it's sort of the wisdom of other types of fermentable grains. This was sort of the thing behind that. But we wanted it to be a word that's easily recognizable. When people say otherwise, you know what it is. You can hear it. It's not some like weird, funky name that they're like, what? How do you spell that or anything like that? Had to be between like 2 and 5 syllables. Like we had a whole bunch of branding considerations around that. So when we finally came across otherwise and we found out it wasn't taken, we're like, oh my God, buying the website right now.
On your phone.
Yeah, no, I like that. I love the name. It's a great name. So I can't.
Thanks.
I think that you guys dodged a bullet by not ordering all those grains for your first batch, right? So hopefully you guys get to open up and do your first batch here and sometime in the summertime. Is that what you're shooting for? Hopefully, sometime in the summertime. You don't know.
I'm not really. I mean, who can know anything right now? I mean, I will play it by ear, see what happens with the virus, and as soon as it's realistic to launch, then we're going to do it.
Cool. Right. Well, thank you so much for joining. It's awesome for you to take your time out of your Sunday to do that, since you have like so many other awesome like vacation opportunities and exciting things to do.
Right.
You chose this one.
Yeah.
You chose wisely.
Right. I could have been folding the laundry instead. All right. Well, this is fun, guys. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you. The blog posts are great. They're quite informative.
Well, that next one you mentioned, that sounds pretty interesting as well. So
yeah. Well, I'll let you all know when it's ready.
Sounds good.
Yeah, and you can go onto your Aaron's website, and I think you can get on your mailing list, right? If you put in your email address, so then I'm sure you'll get spammed by all sorts of stuff then, right?
Oh yeah, night and day.
So if we're still on quarantine, we're going to do another meeting next month with a topic TBD. Maybe we'll do it on grain science and things like that if I can get another guest. But yeah, thanks to everyone for joining. And I think it's time to go drink another beer, right?
All right.
All right, guys.
Thanks for setting it up, Kale.
Have a good Sunday, guys. Thanks for setting it up, Kale.
Cheers.
Cheers, everybody.
Yeah. Take care.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye.